Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're digging into a stack of sources that frankly challenge the way most of us read the New Testament. Our mission is to understand why applying our modern 21st century mindset to a first century document can lead to some pretty massive misunderstandings.
It's a huge issue. These sources argue that if you ignore the historical context, you don't just miss a few details, you actually misinterpret the entire mission of Jesus, the meaning of the Gospels, even the purpose of the church itself.
We've got a lot to get through. We're focusing on Matthew and Revelation, and the goal is to avoid what the sources call the critical error, reading these ancient documents, these Gomen as if they were written yesterday. We're reading them 2,000 years later, and we can't just impose our own assumptions.
And that's the foundational rule, really. The most important thing is to distinguish between the time of the events and the time of the recording. The events with Jesus, that's around 30 AD, but Matthew is being written, maybe 40 years later.
40 years, that's a huge gap.
It is. And the key to understanding isn't just what happened, but the intent of the record keeper at that later date. They weren't just writing down memories. They were crafting a very specific message for a very specific audience facing a very specific crisis.
And we touched on this in our last deep dive, that Matthew's primary audience was his own Jewish community. And his first job wasn't to convert Gentiles, but to correct some pretty serious errors happening within Judaism itself.
Exactly. He was focused on dismantling what the sources call the Ingangbo doctrine. A good translation is the doctrine of human compensation, the idea that your life, your health, your wealth was a direct report card of your standing with God.
Which completely changes how you read the miracle stories. Today, you read about a healing and you think, wow, Jesus is powerful. Maybe I can be healed too.
And that's the modern, decontextualized takeaway. But for someone back then, under that Ingango doctrine, well, the view on sickness was totally different. If you were sick or poor or disabled, you were seen by everyone, including your religious leaders, as a sinner.
So your suffering was proof of your sin.
Yes. It was seen as direct, visible evidence of God's judgment on you. So when Jesus heals someone, it's not just a physical miracle.
It's a theological statement.
It's a dramatic theological argument.
Yeah.
He isn't just showing off his power. He is publicly and very pointedly refuting that entire doctrine. He's proving their whole system is wrong, that suffering isn't automatically a sign of sin. The miracle is the evidence that busts their theology.
That makes the Gospels feel much more confrontational than just, a series of nice stories.
Oh, absolutely. Matthew was targeting that theology, but also the obsession with Sabbath laws and the blind faith people were putting in the physical temple and its whole system of animal sacrifice. He was clearing the ground for something new.
Which I think is the biggest reveal in these sources. Correcting Judaism was really just step one. The real goal was much bigger, establishing the new contract, the new covenant. But to get why a new one was needed, we have to look at the world around them.
We have to zoom out to the geopolitical situation around 70 AD. I mean, we are at the absolute height of the Roman Empire, Pax Romana, the Roman peace.
And the Pax Romana. It's hard to overstate what a big deal that was. The sources lay it out. For nearly 600 years, Rome brought this level of stability that was it was unprecedented.
Think about it. Wars between nations just stopped. Rome built incredible infrastructure roads, sea roads. All roads lead to Rome. They had a postal system.
Wow.
A postal system, free travel with no visas, booming commerce, and they even had a central government that provided disaster relief, like declaring a special disaster zone today.
So it's no wonder that most people were grateful. They literally deified the emperor, put up statues to him. He was the one bringing peace and prosperity.
And yet, in the middle of all this peace, one group consistently caused trouble, constantly resisted, made life miserable for Roman governors. The Jews, Judah, they were the sole resistors.
Why them specifically?
It comes down to theology. I mean, other nations had lots of gods, so adding the emperor to their pantheon was no big deal. But the Jews were rigidly monotheistic. For them, worshiping the emperor was a fundamental violation of their covenant with God. Their resistance wasn't just political, it was built into their faith.
And that constant resistance is what finally led to the catastrophe of 70 AD.
It was the breaking point. The Jewish rebellion got so bad that Rome sent its main army, led by Titus. And they didn't just quell a rebellion, they completely destroyed the nation. Historians agree it was the biggest international event of its time.
And the aftermath was brutal.
Totally. The Jews were expelled, scattered, made an example of. And as a final insult, Rome renamed their land after their ancient enemies, the Philistines. That's where we get the name Palestine.
Okay, so this This historical trauma is the missing key to understanding all those end times prophecies in the Gospels.
Absolutely. When Jesus and the gospel writers talk about the Sisang Zhongmao, the world end, they are not talking about the planet Earth exploding thousands of years in the future. They are primarily referring to the Yude in Zhongmao, the end of the Jewish nation and its broken covenant system.
So when Jesus says things like, when you hear of wars, flee to the mountains, don't go to Jerusalem, that's not some mystical clue for the 21st century.
No, it's an urgent, literal, historical warning for his followers living in that generation. He's telling them, our nation has broken its contract and judgment is coming. The Roman army is coming. Do not stay in Jerusalem.
And the Christians who listened, they survived.
They survived. The ones who stayed in Jerusalem, clinging to this false idea that God would protect the temple no matter what, they perished.
Okay, let's jump forward a couple of decades then to the book of Revelation, written around the mid-90s AD. So if the Gospels were about the end of the Jewish system, Revelation has to be about the end of the actual world, right?
Not if we stick to the context rule. In the mid-90s, the church is facing a totally new crisis. Now, the persecution is coming from Rome itself, from the central government. And it's not a minor problem. The sources call it a tornado.
Right, so if your immediate problem is that you might be executed tomorrow.
Exactly. A prophecy about the end of the planet in 3,000 years is completely useless. It's irrelevant. Revelation's real topic is encouragement for the persecuted. It's telling them how to endure and, crucially, that the evil force persecuting them, the Roman Empire, symbolizes the beast. The dragon will be judged and destroyed by God.
Which explains all the bizarre imagery, the monsters, the bowls of wrath. It's not a literal future map, it's coded language.
It's a specific literary style called Muxi Munhak, or apocalyptic literature.
Yeah.
And the sources are clear. This is fundamentally persecution literature. It's a genre with its own rules, designed to give hope to people facing death by telling them their oppressors are doomed. It's about God's judgment on world-dominating evil, not the end of creation.
Okay, so let's apply the same sharp historical lens to some core church doctrines. The sources have some explosive things to say about the Lord's Supper or communion.
They really do. The main target is the doctrine of huacasil, or transubstantiation, the traditional Catholic view that during the Mass, the bread and wine literally, chemically change into the body and blood of Christ.
And that eating them is key to salvation.
Right. And the sources they call this a red lie. A complete fabrication.
So what was the Lord's Supper actually supposed to be?
It was the ceremony for establishing the new contract. That's it. In the ancient world, you sealed a major contract or a covenant with a formal shared meal. Jesus was simply using a familiar cultural practice to formalize the new covenant with his followers. It's a memorial, an agreement, not a magical ritual.
I can hear people asking, though, if it's just signing a contract, why is it so sacred?
Because the contract is the most important contract in history. The sacredness comes from the magnitude of the agreement you're entering into, not from the bread magically changing its molecular structure. It's about joining a new covenant community, not about, eating magic food.
Okay, let's take that to the cross itself. The idea of substitute atonement, or Dysok. The common teaching is that Jesus died for all our sins, and if you just believe that, you're saved. Faith alone, how you live doesn't really factor in.
And that's where the sources point out the logical absurdity. If salvation is meant to be the ultimate completion of human life, the final graduation, how can your actual life, your actions, your character be totally irrelevant?
It doesn't make a lot of sense when you put it that way. So what was the purpose of the cross, according to this view?
Jesus' death wasn't an automatic salvation ticket. It was the act required to open the new covenant to everyone. The old one was broken by the Jews, and the Gentiles were never part of it. Christ's death fulfilled the old sacrificial requirements, allowing God to establish a new contract that was open to all people. It opened the door so you could come in and start living by the new rules.
So salvation isn't a thing you get, it's a process you start. That's where that school analogy from the sources is so powerful.
It clarifies it perfectly.
Yeah.
You don't get your graduation diploma on the day you enroll in college.
Right.
Believing in Jesus is like enrolling. The church, the Kyoho, is the new contract community. It's the school. Once you're in, you have to learn and actually practice the contract laws, the teachings of Jesus.
And salvation is the final event. It's graduation day, which only happens after you've lived out the contract and passed the course.
Exactly. Claiming you're already saved, the moment you believe is like an enrolled freshman claiming they've already graduated. The sources say it's illogical, and it completely undermines the seriousness of the contract.
And all of this misunderstanding, this illogical thinking, leads to what the sources say is the biggest danger in religion today, the trap of the Hashanbim.
The conviction fanatic.
The conviction fanatic. Explain that.
It's someone who becomes so sure of their beliefs, beliefs often based on these ahistorical, illogical ideas, that their certainty just completely overrides their common sense. They become dangerous because they can't be reasoned with.
And there's a chilling historical example of this right before 70 AD.
The community in Jerusalem was the original case study. They were deeply religious, very active in their faith, but they were absolutely convinced God would protect the temple. So when the Roman armies broke through the city walls, where did they run for safety?
Into the temple.
Right into the temple, thinking it was a divine safe house, and they were slaughtered there.
Oh.
The warning to flee to the mountains was a warning against exactly that kind of deadly, blind conviction.
So if certainty is the trap, let's end by redefining a word we associate with that. Holiness, joy or kata. We think of it as, being solemn, wearing special clothes, rituals.
But the biblical definition is much more practical. It just means to be separated. Go viol.
Separated from what?
Separated from the world's way of doing things. Your entire way of life has to be different.
Yeah.
And the sources are very specific about the core of that difference. It's not about chanting. The core of biblical holiness is a community built on radical equality.
Equality.
The elimination of status, of position, of the wealth gap, the binbe giocha. Be holy, for I am holy, isn't a mystical command. It's a sociological one. It means I want my people to live in a fair, equal, happy community that looks nothing like the world's selfish, unequal system. So separate yourselves and live that way.
So bringing this all home, the main takeaway from the sources is that interpreting scripture is the same as interpreting history. Ignoring the historical context is, as they say, ian iodo dan. It's nonsensical.
Right. Jesus criticized the Pharisees because they could read the weather signs, but they couldn't read the historical signs of their own time. And the sources argue we're making the exact same mistake. We're ignoring the historical reality of the contracts we claim to be a part of.
So the biggest problem in religious communities today isn't a lack of faith or emotion. It's a lack of basic common sense sanksik, which leads right back to that dangerous conviction fanatic.
Because if salvation is about successfully participating in a new contract community, it requires you to be historically aware and to apply common sense to how you live every single day.
So a final thought for you to take away from this deep dive. If genuine holiness is defined by practical equality and closing the wealth gap in your community, and if salvation is about successfully living out that contract, what quantifiable changes would you need to make in your life right now to truly separate yourself from the world system and avoid the trap of the conviction fanatic? Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.